Do the exciting recent developments regarding the UFO phenomena mean we are closer to official government disclosure than ever? What have many of the previous U.S. presidents known about UFO and ET visitations, and how has this impacted the UFO issue in our present day? Are efforts like To the Stars Academy pushing us headlong toward official U.S. government disclosure, or will the truth embargo continue despite their efforts? Will another official head of state announce official UFO disclosure before the U.S. does? What can we do as U.S. citizens to help advance overall awareness of this issue and eventual disclosure? Longtime UFO lobbyist and executive director of the Paradigm Research Group, Mr. Stephen Bassett, joins me tonight to discuss these issues and more. Well, greetings and welcome once again to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and it's so wonderful to be back here with you once again. And we've got a very important issue, a hot-button issue in the UFO community we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is UFO disclosure. So I've got none other than Mr. Stephen Bassett joining me tonight, and Stephen is a longtime UFO lobbyist in the D.C. area, UFO disclosure lobbyist. He is the executive director of the Paradigm Research Group, and so for over 20 years, he's been fighting the good fight in the D.C. area, trying to get UFO disclosure, trying to get the government to finally release what they know about the UFO phenomena. So it's great to have Stephen joining me tonight. In fact, it's a real honor. He's been fighting this fight for some time, and he has a wealth of knowledge on the UFO disclosure movement. And if you have not been over to the Facebook page, please head over to facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the paranormal. Please like and follow us there. And if you haven't been over to the website, please head over there as well. It's at passion, the number 4, the paranormal.com. And on the website, you can catch up with past episodes there. And you can also access links from books from past guests who've been on the show. So some cool things you can do there, so please visit the website. And one of the other things I wanted to do before we get into the discussion here with Mr. Bassett is I wanted to cover some data from a recent Facebook poll that I did. And the Facebook poll was about, of course, the topic we're going to be talking about tonight, and that is UFO disclosure. And a recent Gallup poll shows that 68% of Americans believe there is a government cover-up on the UFO issue. And so the question posed on the Facebook page was, in light of public opinion on the UFO issue, recent mainstream media coverage of UFOs, and the U.S. Navy announcing new protocol for reporting UFOs, do you believe there will be official U.S. government disclosure on the UFO issue soon? So 117 people voted on this question. And the interesting thing is the first couple of days of voting leaned more towards people believing, saying, yes, they do believe that government disclosure will happen soon. And this was a 7-day poll. And as it progressed further into the poll, the numbers began to change. And at the end of the poll, the numbers came out 52% voting no and 48% voting yes. So more people actually seem to believe that there will not be any sort of UFO disclosure on the issue anytime soon. And so I found that interesting that the numbers kind of changed towards the end of the poll there. So I just wanted to share that information. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the discussion with Mr. Bassett. It's going to be a great one. So really hope you enjoy tonight's show. And thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so joining me tonight is Mr. Stephen Bassett, and Mr. Bassett is the Executive Director of the Paradigm Research Group, which is the first UFO lobby group of its kind in the D.C. area. Mr. Bassett established the Paradigm Research Group back in 1996, and he has been featured on many radio and TV programs and shows. He has also spoken at numerous UFO conferences and events across the world, and he is a key player in the UFO disclosure movement. Mr. Bassett, it's an honor to have you joining me on the show tonight. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me.
Happy to do it, Curry. Appreciate this.
Now, Mr. Bassett, you've been involved in this game for quite a while, and I know this subject, and I've heard you even said this subject goes back 70 years, going all the way back to what many UFO researchers consider a key event, and that is the Roswell incident. But I want to talk a little bit about going back to the Eisenhower administration. Do you and I've heard this said before, that Eisenhower late in his administration kind of lost control of the UFO issue, if you will. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of get your thoughts on whether you think that was where maybe presidents had lost control of this issue.
The history of the presidents and his subject is going to get a lot of attention eventually. Grant Cameron established himself as the lead on this. He started going to the libraries many years ago, drove down from Canada in his Cadillac on his days, his weeks off. He got a vacation. He's up in Canada, Winnipeg, and he would go to the libraries and start researching and trying to see if he could find anything that would be connected to a president regarding this issue. And slowly, he built up a file, and this became the website, presidentialufo.com. And he's written one book about it. And then he's actually written two, because he also wrote one about the Clinton administration. And then another fellow has written a book on the White House and the UFO subject as well. And I can find that. So we know some things, but clearly most of what presidents have done, said, heard is classified. And so we are at a disadvantage. We can make reasonably good guesses or assessments based upon just common sense and some history. I'm pretty sure that Truman was informed of the fact that there was a crashed vehicle and there were bodies, and therefore we weren't alone. It wouldn't be much more to tell him than that. I'm sure he wanted to be kept informed as things went forward. And Eisenhower comes in, and I'm pretty sure that he was informed. It's inconceivable that the Army Air Force, or the Air Force by then, I think, and the DOD in general would have somehow shut off a five-star general such as Eisenhower, who was a key figure in defeating the Axis powers and Nazis. They're not going to do that. So he was informed. He kept it under control. He kept it secret. And we know some things we think have took place during his administration. And then things get complicated because Kennedy comes in, a very different kind of man, young, idealistic, a lot of vision. And clearly he suspected or had been tipped off that this was real. Whether or not he got a briefing from the CIA, we don't know, because he and the CIA were at each other almost right away because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which the CIA essentially dumped on him. And things went downhill from there. Later, he engaged the subject a little bit, not long before he was assassinated. And then you just go down the line. And different presidents knew more than others. Some were stonewalled completely, we believe. A few have said things. And that is the presidential history, and that's Grant Cameron. There's a lot on the internet about this. I certainly talk about it a great deal. So what I think the listeners can take away is that, by and large, the presidents have been aware of the ET presence. A number were heavily briefed. They have maintained the secrecy. They've maintained the truth embargo, and only the odd casual remark has emerged in the public. And that's where things stand as of 2019.
Now, subsequent to JFK's, after his presidency, of the presidents, going from Lyndon Johnson all the way down to present day to Trump, who do you feel like's been briefed heavily on the issue? I've heard H.W. Bush, because he was head of the CIA. I'm just curious who you think from there on out was briefed really heavily on the issue and who was not.
Johnson may not have gotten much of a briefing. he comes in and he has to take over for a murdered president, so his hands are full, obviously. And then he's embroiled in a civil rights issue and other things. I don't see it being on his plate. I could see the DOD and the managers of the issue maybe keeping it a distance because there was so much of the turmoil going on. There was, of course, the Vietnam War. So Johnson may have been told by somebody, yeah, it's real, but you got other things to do, Lyndon, so don't worry about it. The boys over at the alphabet agencies will take care of it. Johnson doesn't run again, and Nixon comes in. Nixon was certainly favored by the military intelligence complex. He could have shut the war down right away, but he didn't. He dragged it on quite a while, which I think pleased them greatly. We also have a fairly well-established vignette, and that is the story that was told by his wife to Shirley MacLaine and others, that she has confirmed when questioned on a few occasions. I haven't recently read the write-ups on it, but it's kind of well known that Nixon was a friend of Jackie Gleason. He visited him. They, had a few drinks together, played golf, and on a visit to Florida, Nixon was feeling expansive and told Jackie, "Would you like to see an ET?" And he took him to see some bodies. Some at one of the bases there, I forget the name. Well, if that's the case, then clearly Nixon was had access. But as we know, Nixon had his hands full with the Vietnam War, which didn't get over 75. And, of course, then he gets embroiled in scandal. So he may not have he may not have dipped into it too far. Then, of course, he is forced out, and Ford comes in, but Ford was a caretaker president. Probably was not seen as someone likely to win the next election, or he might have. An interim president, I just don't see them briefing him on this. They would have thought it unnecessary. Carter comes in, and things get interesting because Carter had a sighting. He was talking about it a little bit in the campaign, tapped into the national interest, got a lot of letters, a lot of positive response. And Carter, being Carter, an honest man, he said he would follow up on this, and he did. He tried to create a study, an extensive study that was blocked and undermined by his own agencies. They didn't want him to get involved in this at all. He essentially stonewalled, but he tried, and then he backed off completely. Reagan comes in, and it gets complicated again. Reagan was an unusual man, easily underestimated, but very much willing to defer to others, to delegate. And we believe he was tipped off about the ET issue, maybe given some information. We think that was connected to the SDI program as part of the selling of the program to the president, which he backed fiercely, even though scientist after scientist is coming forward and saying can't work. We think he was told that, well, it's not just about the Russians, Ron, it's about ETs. And you know about ETs. Well, they could be a threat. Let's get some weapons in space. And which meant that he knew, but he basically, I think, would have said to the military intelligence complex, look, you guys know what you're doing there, and I got other things to take care of, like ending the Cold War, and all good. But he was, I'm sure, intrigued enormously by it. So he kept talking about it. He kept referring to it in a number of speeches, to the ET issue, which confounded a lot of people. And then after Reagan, we get George Bush. And that's a different ballgame. Bush was just the height of the military intelligence insider. He had all the credentials, all of the positions, the war hero status, the work, and we feel he was briefed. He was probably given extensive briefing. And if he didn't, he already knew a lot probably going in. And the Cold War was coming to an end. You know, just we're literally wrapping up, and Bush, I think, would have been the disclosure president. I think that would have been the plan. It would have made a lot of sense. He had high ratings. He had the credentials. He would be able to work very well and comfortably with the military intelligence complex on what would be the most important transition in human history. They would be partners and probably quite collegial. But he didn't have a war in Iraq to deal with, and before you know it, his ratings started to get a little wobbly, and before you know it, he didn't win a second term. And it wasn't time to do it in the first term, and so he's off the stage, and in comes Clinton. And Clinton is not George Bush. He's the anti-George Bush. He's everything the military intelligence complex hated, as opposed to everything with Bush that they loved. And so they had no interest in telling him anything. I think by and large they wouldn't have told him his house was on fire if they passed by. But oddly enough, it was Clinton that began what I believe is the ultimate march to disclosure, irreversible march to disclosure, because it was Clinton that was approached by Lawrence Rockefeller and others who felt now was the time to tell the truth to the American people. Cold War's over. And they tried to engage him and move forward on this. And there was a huge pushback from the military intelligence complex. He was ultimately stonewalled. He was ultimately hounded. He was ultimately impeached. And nothing came out during that administration. But the record of that is known. It got into the hands of several researchers. The most comprehensive record got in the hands of Grant Cameron. And he then provided me copies. I provided them to several newspapers, which ignored them. And then I put them up on the internet for everyone to see. And thus we roll on. Clinton was unable to take this issue forward. I think Gore might have, but Gore lost election by one vote. And Gore and Bush comes in, but it's Bush Jr. And Bush Jr. did not have the same rapport with the military intelligence complex that his dad did, and he broke from his dad's advisors. Went down on some interesting paths, and as a result, I don't think he was told anything. I think he was kept out of it. He might have known it was true, but they weren't going to tell him anything significant, and he wasn't going to push him. So we get 8 years under Bush, and really nothing happens, at least on the government side, virtually nothing at all. There were some things happening on our side, for sure. And then Obama comes in, and that's an interesting development because the Clintons were very tight with him. Tight with him. They became very tight with him, and their experience with the ET issue was conveyed to him almost certainly. He surrounded himself with Clinton people: Podesta, Hillary, Leon Panetta. I know I'm leaving one out, at least one more, maybe two. So that the Clinton-ET connection was passed on to Obama, but under some understandings of which we don't know the details. But I think one of those understandings was, this is our legacy, not yours. So we're there with you, but don't go after this. You've got other things to worry about. But the whole history needs to be known. A very complex history there. Obama did try to go after some information. We think Podesta confirmed that. We think he was stonewalled as well again. And then, of course, we have the next election, and Hillary Clinton is running, and the whole story of her connection and connection of her husband and Podesta to the issue exploded into the print media, hundreds of articles. They had to speak the issue. They had to give some statements, controlled statements, give interviews. But the debate moderators didn't ask any questions about it because, well, they're kind of bought and paid for, frankly, and an embarrassment more often than not. So she was able to get through the campaign without getting too pushed on the issue. I believe she intended to disclose. She intended to be the disclosure president, first woman president, major historical figure. She was locked to win, and she lost. So at that point, there was another development going on, which was the To the Stars Academy, which emerged during her campaign. Eventually, I think, planned to go public right after her election. They engaged the Podesta her team, her political team, early in 2016, and there was a lot of correspondence and interaction and so forth, not the Republican side. And we know that because WikiLeaks dumped all of Podesta's emails out, and the connections to the ET issue and Tom DeLonge and so forth all were there. So it was a bit messy, but then she lost, and that thread disappears. A new president comes in, and there's no indication yet that he has the desire, the interest, or the knowledge to tackle this issue. He's dodged the questions comfortably. He has his hands full with the biggest set of constitutional crisis we've ever seen. So it almost wouldn't matter if he knew much, but I don't think he knows much. And at this point, I don't see him pursuing it. So there you go. The short history of the presidential ET connection.
Interesting. The fact that, you go back to President Carter and, Bill Clinton, both had expressed desire before they started their administrations to dig into the UFO issue and to try and open up some of the files. And it seemed Hillary was on the same track here. But on the flip side of that, does that perhaps close up the military-industrial complex from trusting and wanting to share information with them on the issue?
Is that a question?
Yeah, so the question was, because the fact that it seems that Carter and Bill Clinton, and then following with Hillary, they had both stated an intent to try and dig into the UFO issue and open up the files. Did that lead to the intelligence community not trusting them and being less willing to share information with them?
No, the managers of the ET issue had no intentions of ending the truth embargo. They may have briefed presidents from time to time, but I seriously doubt they encouraged them to end this embargo, and probably encouraged them not to end it. So when Obama, Carter, and Clinton tried to get information, they just weren't going to get it. Now, whether it irritated the military, I don't know. Maybe it did. Frankly, then they should have just quit. But they weren't going to tell them, and they nearly had control of the issue. So I don't think they felt threatened. It was more of a hassle, if anything. And that's obviously a constitutional breach, which has been in place for a long time. And if you had a breach in a boat as big as that one, the boat would sink. But this is a big boat, ship of state. So it hasn't sunk yet. But again, this relationship between the issue, the military intelligence complex, and presidents, Grant did some writing. Another fellow whose name I need to get did some writing on this. Malcolm, what's his first name? But I assure you, many, many more books are going to be written about the history of the U.S. presidency and the extraterrestrial issue.
Yeah, I had Larry Holcomb on the show, and he wrote the book Presidents and UFOs.
Yes.
He also covered this pretty extensively in the history of the presidents and the issue. The other thing that becomes difficult here when we try and wrap our arms around this issue is you hear a lot of talk about the deep state. And, you hear that term thrown around a lot. And the military-industrial complex, I don't know if they're one and of the same or not, because, me being an outsider on this issue, it's hard to really kind of come to terms with this stuff. But from your perspective, when we're talking about the deep state or the military-industrial complex and those in the know, who do you think we're talking about here?
The military intelligence industrial complex, it's really four things. Eisenhower just referred to the military industrial complex. He wanted to say congressional, but they talked him out of that. was actually the military industrial intelligence congressional complex. It's known. I mean, we know what it is. We know the agencies it's made up. There's no secrets there. The deep state, on the other hand, is a meme. It doesn't impress me at all. It's just a meme. Two words put together to represent a whole bunch of people's game plans, agendas, frustration, what have you. And so it's really meaningless, except as a kind of a propaganda term. It's a catch-all basket where people just throw every one of their suspicions, paranoias, irritations into it and call it all a deep state thing. It's not helping. It's not constructive. I don't use it, and I don't think it'll have a particularly long history, to be honest with you.
Interesting. I wanted to go back to Hillary Clinton, and you had mentioned one of the other interviews I'd heard you talking about the fact that there was high hopes that she was going to be the disclosure president. I know you already mentioned this. How do you, because we already mentioned Carter and her husband both got stonewalled on the issue. What do you think was different in the dynamics there that would have allowed her to disclose that didn't allow her husband or Carter to disclose?
It's a good question. The Rockefeller Initiative lasted from March of 93 to roughly the fall of 96. One of his key advisors, George Stephanopoulos, who was aware of the Rockefeller Initiative, certainly, left the administration at that point, became a big guy at NBC News, where he remains many decades later. And they really didn't know what to do next, and before you know it, Clinton was involved in another sex scandal and ultimately was impeached. It was early, and overall the truth embargo was under control, particularly when George W. Bush won the election. Gore was relatively respected by the military, DOD. He had served on the Armed Services Committee. He had done a lot of good work on the arms control. He's a smart man. He's not the most dynamic presence, Lord knows. His speaking style is somnambulent, but nevertheless, he might have been able to work with the Pentagon. The Pentagon might have been able to work with him. We might have seen something happen there. But George W., no. They did not. I don't think they wanted him to be in front of this issue. So things just sort of settled back. Now, the activist movement, the research movement, the citizen science effort, that continued unabated. It's never stopped. Some media successes took place. We got some stories. We had some witnesses come forward. There's always events happening in the disclosure, small d disclosure process and the exopolitical process. And over time, the awareness of the issue every passing year would get greater. More people, millions more every year, would figure it out. The internet, of course, added a whole new dimension to it. Massive information available there, hundreds of thousands of websites. So the public awareness continues to grow while Bush is president. It continues to grow while Obama is president. But only Hillary and her husband and Bassett and a few others there really had the connection and had been speaking to it off and on carefully. But so when she starts her campaign in late 2014, 2 years ahead of the election, that whole election cost about $4 billion. The citizen hearing had just taken place in the spring of 2013. It got a decent amount of attention. It was held at the National Press Club, where I'm now officed, and was a mock congressional hearing that pretty much demonstrated what real hearings would be like if we held them today. And she was aware of that. Of course, the hearing did include testimony, 3 hours of testimony about the Clinton connection to the ET issue. And I knew that I delivered a full 30-hour set of DVDs of the entire hearing, citizen hearing, to every member of Congress in November of 2014. So the status on the issue is simply a lot more mature than it was in '93, way more mature. And the media was getting involved. They started covering it. They wrote articles about it. She didn't really want to be pushed on it. She wanted to just get to the White House, which she felt was a guaranteed, and then she could move freely. But she got pressed on the issue because I was working it extremely hard in Washington, all from November of 2014 right up to the election. But it didn't quite, well, it didn't get her to make strong early statements, which might have gotten her the election. And ultimately she lost. So I think if I had to ask her a question, I've only spoken to her just for 10 seconds, a long, long time ago, at the Women's Veterans Memorial. I would say, did you feel that your husband was denied one of the greatest legacies that any head of state would ever have by his own military, his own Department of Defense, stonewalled him, and then probably helped the right wing go after him on various scandals and so forth? There's been a constitutional breach, and then hounded him. And now you have a chance to be president, the first woman president. Did you feel that you had a compelling desire, a need to take that legacy that was denied your husband or yourself, and bring it home, both you and him, and have that as probably your most important legacy going forward? I think she did. I think that's exactly what she wanted. She was prepared to do it, and the prospect of a woman who was tough. I mean, she's a tough woman. Everybody knows that she can be pretty tough when she wants to, including going to war. But the prospect of a woman president heading on down to the Pentagon, or even worse, calling the top people in the Pentagon to the Oval Office and just basically saying, "You're going to tell me everything, or I'm going to fire you all, every one of you. Your careers will end in disgrace, and I'll replace you with more people. And if they don't tell me what I want to know, I'll fire them." Let me tell you, that would have been quite a spectacle, and totally within her power. So that's my sense. But they have not spoken a word about the subject since the election, even though they talked about it many times during the election campaign. But once she lost, they've absolutely kept silent. At any time, they could give an interview to some major newspaper, major columnist, and all hell could break loose. But if they did that, if they were to speak freely, there's a possibility it would trigger the disclosure event. And of course, the president, who would be the disclosure president, would be the man who beat her. And I think that's probably the worst nightmare that they could imagine. He gets the legacy that both she and her husband were denied. So we got a complex dynamic here. I hope it gets sorted out sooner than later.
One of the things that I wanted to ask here is, it sounds like you had pretty good sense that she was going to disclose at some level, based on the fact that Trump won the presidency and now he's going to be seeking re-election. Assuming he does get re-elected, and that's a big assumption at this point, how far back do you think this has set the disclosure effort? I mean, are we talking this has set it back 4 years, 8 years? What's your sense on that?
I cannot make a prediction because the situation that would be in place upon the re-election of Donald Trump would be so chaotic, so hyper, that I don't think any issue other than Trump versus America could possibly make much progress. This is unusual times we're in. This is not anywhere near normal, and people are barely keeping up. So the process has been slowed, but the To the Stars Academy, of course, has done some extraordinary things and advanced the issue of disclosure greatly, and they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes. So they're not sitting idle, but they're not in the public too much because, again, the public commons is completely consumed by multiple constitutional crises. So I just don't know. I will say this, that the longer this political turmoil in America continues, the likelihood that another head of state will be the first to disclose increases. So I'm certainly anticipating the possibility of another head of state being the disclosure head of state.
Which brings me to my next question. I heard you mention another interview that you think that head of state may be Vladimir Putin. Can you talk a little bit about why you think he may be the disclosure president and not the U.S. president?
Fairly straightforward analysis. Putin certainly knows about the ET presence. Putin has been briefed, told anything he wants. He wants to see bodies, he sees them. If he wants to see engineering, he sees it. Anybody in the military, the intelligence community that tried to deny him that would probably not end well. So he knows. We also know that he's angry at the United States for humiliating Russia after the breakup, pressing back on it, pushing NATO into his former republics. He's committed himself to disrupting our society as pushback against what he considers, and many Russian people consider, unfair, unreasonable, and arrogant. He's already created a lot of chaos, and taking the disclosure mantle away from the United States would be an unbelievable coup, and would create even more consternation over here and more disruption. So it just seems to be a perfect fit for who he is, what he wants, his history, and so forth. Now, maybe the geniuses at the Pentagon see it differently. Maybe their supercomputers have run the numbers, and Vlad's not going to disclose. Of course, they seem to have missed Vlad going to upset the election through massive interference by IT guys sitting at desks at computers pumping propaganda into the social media. They missed that. So I'm not confident they would see this coming. But he's the number one. He's number two on the list, and I think at times he's number one. It varies. But he's the likely person that might do it. I actually talked about this when I interviewed in Moscow. I went public right there on camera. That interview was mentioned. Some of that interview was aired. It got seen almost certainly by the Kremlin, and I didn't have any problem getting out of the country. There was some articles in Prague.ru about how I was there talking about and not advocating, but considering that Putin could be a disclosure president. And I got the footage of the film and so forth. Every indication was that they were totally comfortable with this concept and not the slightest bit upset that I came to Russia and actually mentioned it on camera in Moscow. And so, and the reason I did it was to test the waters. I met with some groups there as well, people who had military and government connections and worked in programs, and we didn't say much to each other because the translator was so-so, and I failed Russian twice in college. But it didn't matter. It was just a hello, how are you? But I knew that those meetings guaranteed that Putin would know that I was there and what I was talking about. So that confirmed to me that it's not off his bucket list. And I can assure you, if Vladimir Putin discloses the ET presence, the U.S. is going to pay a heavy price. But you want to know something, Curry? The U.S. has gone out of its way to pay the heaviest possible price it can in almost every circumstance it has dealt with, which is why we're in the situation we're in today. A lot of rich people, seemingly low unemployment, seemingly wealthy, though massively in debt, but a nation of incredibly stressed out people killing themselves on opioids, taking every kind of prescription drug you can imagine, addicted to cigarettes, sugar, alcohol, pot, you name it, just to keep sane. So it will not surprise me if we decide to pay the heaviest possible price on the disclosure and have Putin basically pull the rug out from under us and leave the entire political class of America with their pants down as he ascends to the world stage as the great truth teller and achieves the greatest political legacy in history. That's what I try to tell people. That's what I'd love to tell people in major media, members of Congress and so forth, in hopes that they might actually get it. But it's not easy because the truth embargo has got things still pretty tied up.
Yeah, which brings up my next point. So there's a lot of interesting developments in the UFO community, and you already alluded to some of them. To the Stars Academy efforts, the Navy videos that were released, and I've talked to other UFO researchers that have told me, who cares that the U.S. government has not disclosed? We know it's true. There's a mountain of UFO researchers out there digging into the subject. We just seen the latest Gallup poll that says 68% of the population believes the government is covering up the issue. And so are we, to some degree, we had Christopher Sherwood come out and say, yeah, the ATIP program existed, and it was looking at, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically saying, yeah, we're studying it. It was looking at the UFO phenomena. And so, to some degree, some might say we've already had some degree disclosure, even though it hasn't been an official head of state that's done that.
There's always been disclosure going on, small d disclosure, a revealing process. This has been going on for 70 years solid. The only disclosure I'm interested in is capital D disclosure, and that's the formal announcement. And people that think we don't need a formal announcement don't understand how government works or how their society works. If the government declares war, and a bunch of people say, well, that don't matter to me, right? I don't want to go to war. Guess what? They come, they get you, they draft you, they put you in a uniform and send you overseas. What government does matters. And when government gets in the way of stuff, things don't happen. And so people that have said, I give up on government, I don't care, and it doesn't matter what they do, well, they're living in a fantasy world, and you're going to pay a heavy price for that. Because there's been no confirmation, it's not taught in any schools, anywhere, except for a couple of vanity courses. That's 5,000 colleges and universities. Millions of professors have come through the university college system in America since 1947. All embargoed. Don't teach it. Don't talk about it. Stay away from it. And if you do, we're gonna tweak you a little bit. Media is not properly investigated. Historians have not properly written up. A whole lot of major history is probably going to be lost. And interference, undermining, wasted time. Yeah, that's what has happened because the government has not done what it's supposed to do. And so, but people have gotten frustrated. They're so tired of the government not doing what it needs to do that they just said, the hell with it. You're not going to do what needs to be done. I don't care anymore, and I'm just going to live my life. That's fine. I get it. But unfortunately, you don't fix the car. You can say, I don't give a damn what's wrong with the car. I'm headed to Des Moines, and I'm going to get there. And then you find yourself on the side of the road with a broken down car. And you're not going anywhere. So I understand their frustration, but that's why you have political activists. Their job is to get past the frustration, press the government to do the right thing, and move forward. That's what activism has always done. And it succeeds quite often. And we'll succeed in this. Disclosure, the capital D confirmation of the ET presence is absolutely inevitable.
So my next question would be, what can we do as private citizens, people like myself that are not lobbyists, what can we do to help the effort? And what the second part of the question is, what can we do and what is it going to take as far as, putting pressure on the government to finally get them to tell the truth about this?
There's a lot of pressure coming from many directions. Increased media attention, witnesses coming forward, public awareness, series on cable series on television, movies, docs. This is all putting pressure on this embargo, which is becoming increasingly frenzied. Particularly witnesses coming forward, like the nuclear tampering witnesses, ET nuclear tampering witnesses, very powerful. What the general public can do, most people, the poor people, their principal job is to get through the day and be able to eat and have a place to sleep and maybe take care of the kids. and they haven't got time or the resources to support the advocacy movement. The wealthy people, on the other hand, have all the money and time they could want, but they're so concerned that getting involved in this issue, and I don't mean doing some research on sightings. I'm talking about getting involved in the advocacy, which they do in spades every 2 years and certainly every 4 years when it comes to political elections and so forth. Spend billions, but virtually without exception, none of them, of the wealthy class, will fund the advocacy work toward disclosure because they don't want to be either embarrassed or have a problem or whatever. And so that's tough because that kind of means that nobody is going to fund it except the people in the middle, and that's the middle class that's doing okay, but not rich. And they know something about the issue. And they're the ones that have been providing support that have allowed me to keep going and some others. They go to the conferences. They buy tickets. I wish they could do more because right now the advocacy work, funding the advocacy movement of this disclosure advocacy movement would get the best bang for its buck because we're close to pulling this off. I hope some people will step in. That's the thing they can do. They can write their Congress representatives. They can yell at their media. But really, the best thing they can do is provide the funding because most of the people, we're not in business. We're not selling stuff. We're not running advertisements for aluminum siding so that we can pay for the advocacy. We do it by contributions, one way or another. And so that's the best advice I could give people that would like to be part of this. But I certainly don't encourage anybody to put money into this advocacy that they simply cannot afford to donate. We'll get there. Take care of yourself and your family.
The next thing is I wanted to mention is suppose, and this, this is a big suppose, Trump was all of a sudden has decided to come out and do a press conference and disclose at some level. Eventually he feels the pressure enough. How does that come about? I mean, if he comes out and says, we know the UFO phenomena is real, and we're looking into it, and he announces that to the public, is there any more going to be coming out of that? Or, what can we expect with official disclosure should it happen?
I talk about how official disclosure could happen, and I've talked about it frequently. But your question is, what can we expect from official disclosure from Trump? I don't know. It's simply impossible to predict what he will do. It would be very odd, very unusual. I think the military intelligence community would not be happy. I don't know how it would go. Somebody who is probably the most severe pathological liar that's ever been in the White House, either as a president or vice president, maybe even the most pathological liar that's ever been in Congress. Not he hasn't been in Congress, but just referring to that group, to come forward with the greatest truth ever told. I think there's been a couple of movies with names along those lines. The greatest story ever denied. That would be ironic in the extreme. And then the question would be, would anybody believe him? The debunking would be intense. And would the military intelligence complex back him up? They might say, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. But if the military intelligence complex were to get in full cooperative mode with the White House, and some understandings can be reached, it's not out of the question.
And that begs the question as well, if he were to do so, and in lockstep with the intelligence community, do you think this would actually help him or hurt him politically?
It's more likely it'll help him politically than not.
This gets to the kind of the trust issue. I think a lot of people are distrusting of government, and I mentioned the poll there. I think that's indicative of people's mistrust. So Yeah, I would like to think that it would help if he came out, but I'm very cautiously optimistic on it. I'm kind of in agreement with you there. I'm not sure it's ever going to happen, especially as long as Trump is president. You've talked about To the Stars Academy and some of their efforts. Now, Tom DeLonge has come out recently, and there's been a buzz about this, that there is a big announcement coming soon. I think that he mentioned this, he tweeted this. Do you have any idea what that announcement may be and what may be coming there?
I have some ideas, but I'm not fully sure of the chronology here, because things are happening so quick. Many things are happening at once, and a lot of things are happening quickly. And I've said perhaps on a few occasions that in the last days of the truth embargo, the last days and weeks, things are going to be happening so fast, multiple things happening so fast, that trying to keep up will be like counting boulders in an avalanche. So I think it's possible that his statement about something, a big announcement is coming, may have been referring to the Navy statement, which was pretty significant, that, and without mentioning too many words, they stated that the gun camera footages, the FLIR, forward-looking infrared images presented to the New York Times were, in fact, from the Navy F-18s sent up to intercept these UAPs. And they also mentioned, this was interesting, that but they didn't authorize the release, which I thought was intriguing. I have a feeling I know why they said that. The Navy's in a tough spot. And my dad was in the Navy, by the way. He was a career Navy warrant officer, and I was a military brat and hung around military Navy bases and so forth most of my childhood. The Navy's been involved in the ET issue going way back. It's been looked at. There's some research on it, but it's not deeply secret stuff. But the Navy was clearly involved. You say, why not the Air Force? Well, if you park it at the Navy, people are less likely to go look for it. But when the To the Stars went to the New York Times with that gun camera footage, it had been declassified by the Pentagon and given to Luis Elizondo specifically so he could make it part of the To the Stars Academy's initiative. After he had left government, and so had the others. The Department of Defense did not need the Navy's approval to release those documents. It might have been a courtesy for them to at least tell them, but my guess is they maybe didn't tell them, because if they had told them and the Navy had said don't do it, the DOD would have to say, well, we're going to do it anyway. And you know, that's just, everybody loses face in a situation like that, so just don't tell them. But the story comes out. And what did the public learn? The public learned that the U.S. Navy had been sitting on for 13 years the extraordinary events of 2004 in their carrier group off San Diego, and also sitting on a couple of years the events surrounding the Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they had been suppressing pilot reports. In other words, being part of the truth embargo. But they were outed. And right. It's embarrassing. And they did the wise thing. They decided to take measures that showed that they're aware of this public relations problem and wanting to maybe be part of the solution. And so that's the reason why they announced they were changing the protocols regarding sightings. They then announced that they were telling their pilots to report these things to us. And that the real statement, though, was confirming that those were in fact legitimate videos, because they were getting a lot of pressure, a lot of attacks, a lot of debunking, and that's not helping anybody. So they did that. It's a big announcement. I think that's what he may have been referring to. But there could be another one. Believe me, there's plenty of announcements. There's so many announcements that could happen if people wanted to do it. So we're in a very interesting situation right now, and it's exciting. I'm excited to be in Washington. I've got an office now in the press building, 2 blocks from the White House. I'm going to run the first streaming broadcast. It'll be a podcast, but it will be a broadcast on exopolitical issues out of Washington, first time ever. It's called The Disclosure Wire. My co-host is Teresa Tyndall, the State Director of Maryland MUFON, and who has a lot to bring to the table on this subject. So it's a two-person video podcast. It'll start in a few weeks, and it'll be broadcast. The interviews will take place in the National Press Building, and I'm going to be going up on the Hill. I'm a registered lobbyist. Teresa is a registered lobbyist, and we're going to start talking to some people up there, like the To the Stars Academy guys are, but from a little different perspective, because the members of the To the Stars Academy have these extraordinary careers in service, government service, various agencies, and politics, with significant, obviously, security classification, non-disclosure agreements, what have you. Now they've stepped out, and now they're advancing this issue, which is great. But when they're up on the Hill, and they have been for years, talking to people and expressing their concerns and what have you, as far as I'm concerned, they are representing the military intelligence complex. The military intelligence complex has got plenty of interests and views about how things should go forward with this and the national security impact. And given their whole backgrounds, they're going to be seeing it from that perspective. So they're representing, and that's fine. The military intelligence complex should have their interests and concerns represented on the Hill. But who's representing the interests and concerns of the American people? Well, that's where I come in. That's what I do. I don't represent the interests of the Pentagon or the CIA, DIA, the NSA, Lockheed Martin. I simply represent the issue on behalf of the American people in order to help ensure that they are not left out of the equation as things move forward, both pre-disclosure and post-disclosure. And I intend to stay in Washington until disclosure happens.
Yeah, that's interesting because, there's been congressional hearings. They've been private. They've been, I suppose you want to call them classified, with the Navy pilots involved in that incident, or at least I'm aware of one of them. But how does Congress come into play here? I mean, do you think we might get to a point where they hold public hearings, congressional hearings on this issue, and say Trump doesn't move on this issue? Can Congress really compel disclosure by themselves?
There are going to be a lot of congressional hearings over the next 3 to 4 months, but they're not going to be about disclosure or ETs. But they're going to be very intense, and a lot of people are going to watch. There's just no room on Congress's plate for an issue of this magnitude right now. So it's not going to happen. There will be congressional hearings. There's no question. But perhaps they will not be until the post-disclosure world, meaning that a head of state will move, it's done, and then Congress can hold hearings until the cows come. Whether the Congress will hold any hearings actually helping disclosure to happen, well, that would be an act of Congress. That would be an action on the part of Congress so reasonable, so appropriate, so needed, so wise, that it's hard for me to comprehend them doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not how they roll.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's been a lot of mistrust in Congress over, the past 10, 20, 30 years or so. And I'm not, again, they've held the private hearings, but I know there's been a lot of push. One has been by Dr. Stephen Greer to try and get Congress to allow some of these former military witnesses to actually go in and testify about what they know about the issue. But it's just interesting because it just never seems like it's ever gained traction. You mentioned the National Press Conference hearings that have happened and some of the recent ones. But, that's where I would really like to see some movement, is see it on congressional side. But it's interesting to get your take on that, because it doesn't sound like maybe not anytime soon.
Not now. You're not going to see it now. There
Interesting.
haven't been any here. I want to coach your nomenclature there. There has not been a hearing on the ET issue since 1968. What there have been is some meetings, briefing of members of Congress by people in the field, but most importantly and most recently, the To the Stars Academy people. But that's not hearings. If there were secret hearings held, well, I don't know about them because they were secret. I'd be surprised. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I'd be surprised. So once more, to sort of wrap this up, we are in very unusual times. History is a powerful, complex, moving object. It doesn't really much care what your hopes and dreams are. It unfolds. There are billions of vectors and variables and people involved. And you think you can maneuver within it. You think you can swim between the shores and get where you're going. But you're really just a little fish in a very vast flowing river. So at any time you can drown or be thrown up on the shore. All you can do is your best. And right now we're in historical times, again, politically historical times. And as a result, every activist movement in the country is in a state of uncertainty, if not recidivism or retrenchment. And that's just the way it is. And that's the same way it happened with war. I mean, when war comes along, everybody's agenda is put aside. All your hopes and dreams are put aside, and you've got to go win a war one way or another. That's what you do. 4 years, 5 years, if it's a major war, a world war. And then when it's over, you kind of get back to what you're doing. Kind of like that now. Until we get this resolved, this mess untangled, it's going to be difficult for major breakthroughs unless they come from outside the United States.
Well, hey, Mr. Bassett, I really appreciate you joining me and taking the time to talk with me today. I'll be looking out for that Disclosure Wire podcast. That sounds like that's going to be quite interesting. I'm looking forward to that. I will definitely check that out. Can you just mention the website, your website, for the listeners, so if they want to go check out your work and all the efforts you're doing there with Paradigm Research Group, where they can go?
Yeah, paradigmresearchgroup.org. It's a long name, long URL. Or just Google Stephen Bassett with a PH. Just type in Stephen Bassett, and it comes right up. It's the number one. It'll be the first link, and you're there. It's a huge site. You can stay on it for weeks. So go to it, and there is a contribution section. And there's also a subscription. Not subscription, but you could subscribe. It's free to the PRG updates, and you'll get some updates from time to time. And I invite people to do that. And there's also a link to the funding effort that's going to help ensure that the Disclosure Wire podcast is got some good technology and is done at a high level, professional level. So that there's a link to that and a lot of other things. And that's a lot. I appreciate your promoting that. And if things get cooking again, if things pick up speed, get in touch. We'll do another show.
Sounds good. Hey, thank you again, Mr. Bassett, for joining me. It was a real pleasure. And best of luck to you and your efforts with PRG and your disclosure efforts. Okay, so there was my interview with Mr. Stephen Bassett, and I really thought that was a good one. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is really a hot-button issue amongst the UFO community. The UFO disclosure movement has really been something that has been on the minds of many UFO researchers for many years, so it was great to pick Mr. Bassett's brain and kind of see or get an idea of where he feels we're at with the UFO disclosure movement. Make sure you don't miss next episode. This is my Halloween special episode. And for the first part of that, I'm going to have my interview with Gary Michael Vassie. He's rejoining me on the show to talk about some of his scariest stories from his new book, Scary Best of My Haunted Life 2. So he's going to be sharing some very scary and spooky ghost stories there. And then the second part, I've got a special guest joining me. We're going to share some listener stories and some ghost stories of our own. So please make sure you don't miss that one. I think it's going to be a great one. And this is first time we've done this. And so I'm really looking forward to that episode. And thank you so much for tuning in to the show. And have a great night, everybody.